My name is Hiram W. Grant. That I've ended my life and I am buried here at Willowdale Cemetary. It's far from where I began. I was born in Woonstock, Rhode Island, January 26, 1843, where my father was superintendent of a cotton mill. Interesting that even my livelihood through my father was tied to the South. He, of course, dependent upon Southern cotton growers. I had a happy childhood. I went to public school, and then I went to Woodstock Academy in Providence. When I graduated, the war had begun, and I had enlisted as a private as the 6th Connecticut in the 6th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry. I first saw action in Charleston Harbor in 1863 at the Battle of Morris Island. Our goal was to take Fort Wagner on Morris Island in order to launch an attack on Charleston. We were joined in battle with 4 other Union regiments and the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Regiment. I mention this regiment by name because it was the first ever Negro unit recruited in the North. This unit led in the attack on Fort Wagner. After many hours fighting, we were all wounded and confined to a hospital in Beaufort for 8 months before I could rejoin my regiment. During this time, my parents sent me a watch and chain for which I was most grateful for and treasured for many years. I also saw action in Fort Fisher, a battle which helped to seal the fate of the Confederacy. Only a few months afterwards, General Lee had surrendered. When the war ended, I was made provost at Wilmington until 1866, when I became the 3rd and last provost marshal for Goldsboro. You now see how I came to be here. During my tenure in Goldsboro, I grew to like the place and mostly its people. I returned to Connecticut, where I married Elizabeth Green, who I called Lizzie, and brought her back to make a life here in Goldsboro. In 1868, I was elected to the North Carolina Constitutional Convention. I was elected to the North Carolina Senate twice, where I was particularly interested in the education of children in eastern North Carolina. I worked hard and I was successful in establishing grade schools in this area. I served as school trustee and secretary of Goldsboro Schools for 20 years and was secretary and treasurer of the Colored Normal School for 10 years. I served as an alderman, and in 1899 I was appointed clerk of the United States District Court for Eastern North Carolina. In 1874, I purchased most of the abandoned lots in Old Waynesboro. It was here that I had established a brick manufacturing. I also formed a real estate firm. As I related, Lizzie and I have 5 kids, all of whom went to Goldsboro schools. We lived at 308 South William Street, which I built using bricks made at my brickworks. I also gave the bricks to St. Stephen's Episcopal Church for them to build their own bell tower. Lizzie and I were active members of the First Baptist Church, where Lizzie was a Sunday school teacher, and I had arranged to build her a primary department Sunday school. One of the saddest days of my life was January 20th, 1913, when my dear Lizzie passed away following an operation. She rests here beside me. Her counsel, loyalty, and frugality characterized all of the years of our happy and devoted home life here in Goldsboro. In conclusion, I would have to say that I have lived a good and fruitful life. My life is my testimony, so now I bid farewell. As Timothy in the good book tells us, brethren, be not weary in well-doing. Good evening.
My name is Gertrude Wheel. I was born here in Goldsboro in 1879 to my parents, Henry and Mina Rosenthal Wheel. Before we continue, I'd like to note I normally would not have dressed such as this in my life. In most young portraits you see of me where I'm wearing clothes like this, my mother dressed me. She always wanted me to look nice for special occasions. And I think if she knew where I was right now, she'd say this is one of those occasions. Anyway, moving on. My siblings were Lisa, Janet, and Herman Wheel. I never married or had children, but I had plenty of cousins, nieces, and nephews to keep me company. I was educated here in Goldsboro until I was 16 when my parents sent me to New York City to attend the Horace Mann High School, a part of Columbia University. From there, I went to Smith College at Northampton, Massachusetts. I graduated in 1901 as their first female graduate from North Carolina. While at Smith, I made many lifelong friends with other writers and social activists that were known across the country. After college, I considered staying in the Northeast, but my parents insisted that I come home to take care of my mother, who had poor health, and help her with her own local community activities. Her and my Aunt Sarah were very busy organizing the local women's club and the local public library, just to name a few of the things they were involved in. In 1919, I actually moved to Raleigh for the full year to spend all of my time lobbying the North Carolina congressional delegation to ratify the 19th Amendment and give women the right to vote. I gave talks, I wrote letters and gave phone calls, anything that I thought could help. Finally, Tennessee was the 36th state to ratify the amendment, tipping the scale for all the women in America, giving us all the right to vote. Unfortunately, North Carolina did not ratify the amendment until 1971, just before I died. In 1920, I organized the North Carolina Association of Voting Women to educate women about matters of voting. I wanted them to feel confident and empowered in doing what is right and what is necessary as a citizen. In 1922, I made national headlines when, while voting, I spotted a stack of illegally marked ballots that I promptly ripped up. I campaigned against lynching, and I even desegregated a pool in my 80s when I jumped into a black pool head first. One of my finer moments, I'd like to say. I was very fortunate to have many friends that I wrote to and visited often. In Eli Evans' book, The Provincials, he wrote about when I discoursed Kant and I heard Nellie Melba sing. I even vacationed in Villa Tati in Italy for a summer. I was rather cosmopolitan in my tastes, I suppose. When I was in Goldsboro, I invited anyone and everyone to come have dinner with me at my home. I loved hearing people's stories. It would take quite a while for me to pass around servings at family dinners because I was too interested in talking to people to actually pass around food. I loved hearing people's life stories about their skills, their occupations, anything they had to offer, I would gratefully listen to. When I had family over in my study, I'd often sit on the ground or on a very low stool to play with the children. I had a closet full of toys that I thought they'd enjoy, an abacus, blocks, bean bags, anything that I thought would engage their minds and give them something to learn. When I wasn't entertaining or traveling, however, I was reading. I subscribed to many magazines and newspapers from all around the world to read people's stories and find out how I can help them with their own personal battles in their own personal communities. For example, my family donated Herman Park for the betterment of the community. Leonard Rogoff says in the biography he's written about me, "One simple reason for her achievement was that she was a Wheel." Many in North Carolina knew nothing about Goldsboro except that it was home of the Wheel family. In the state, few names can match it for solid citizenship. Wheels were entrepreneurs, philanthropists, and civic leaders. Wheel men and women served on state and commercial boards and committees. They funded parks, hospitals, campus buildings, scholarship funds, welfare programs, and lecture series. I had very big shoes to fill. I became a speaker in demand, and I traveled all across the country spreading my passions and hopefully inspiring others to spread theirs. I came here to Willowdale in 1971. A day before my passing, some family came to visit me, and they were telling me about how schools were trying out a new thing where they'd put different grade levels in one room and teach them at the same time. I was very interested in how that worked, and I asked for them to arrange for me to see one of these classrooms and to see it in action, just how teachers handled that many children. I unfortunately died the next day, and I never got to see those classrooms. Thank you for coming to listen to me tonight. Hopefully I've inspired you to share your own personal passions and to embrace new ideas. Thank you.
Giving me an opportunity to read you a story that you really need to hear. As you know, in history textbooks, much has been written about this Civil War. About the battles that were won or lost, about the soldiers that were wounded or killed, about the territories that were gained or forfeited, but not enough has ever been written about the families and what they endured during this war. I wrote this letter to my family so that future generations might know our history, but they might also remember what our family endured during this war, and might understand that it was not just the soldiers that suffered. My letter. My name is Harriet Cobb Lane. I was born on a plantation 9 miles from Goldsboro, on the south side of the Neuse River, the daughter of William Cobb and Anne Collier Cobb. My father was a stock farmer, and he did not raise cotton until the war began. All Southern farmers then began to raise cotton so that we might help clothe our Confederate soldiers. We did not approve of secession, but we wanted to fight for states' rights under the same flag our fathers had fought for. My father and mother gave 4 sons to the Confederate service. They were among the very first to volunteer when Governor Ellis called for volunteer soldiers to defend the state. In 1864, my sister and I were day scholars at St. Mary's School in Raleigh. But after Richmond fell, we both quit school, and we went to hospitals as nurses. All the wounded from Richmond and Petersburg were brought to Raleigh, and later from Bentonville. Every available place was filled with wounded and dying soldiers. After the Battle of Bentonville, Sherman marched to Goldsboro, passing and resting one night upon my father's plantation. The day before Sherman reached our home, my father called his slaves together, and he said to them, "In a few days you will be free. Sherman will be here, and he will destroy everything. The crop, as you know, is already planted, so he cannot destroy that. We have lived here in peace together many years, and the land, the seed, and the fertilizer are mine. But if you will stay and work the crop, you can gather it into 2 portions. You then will select a man, and I shall select a man, and these men will decide which portion is to be mine." Our faithful Negroes remained on the place and finished the crop. Sherman had given orders to his troops when he reached Fayetteville to destroy all property which would be of any use to the enemy. This order is recorded in the congressional records of the United States in Washington, D.C. His army carried out his instructions along the line of the march. When they arrived, they destroyed all of our household furniture, leaving only the bed upon which my sick mother lay, and a large dining room table with a few chairs that Sherman and his officers used as a meeting table while they stayed upon our plantation. His army destroyed literally every useful thing we had. They filled our well with dead hogs. They shot our cows and all other living things, leaving what they did not want on the ground to waste. They rolled all of the barrels filled with the year's supply of molasses into our front hall. They then smashed them open and let the molasses run out all over the front hall. And then they brought quantities of rice, oats, peas, and meal that we had been saving, and they poured all of this onto the molasses. Then they went upstairs. They cut up the feather beds. They broke all the windows. They ran their horses through the molasses mess in our front hall, right through our home. Not just the windows they broke the doors and the window blinds. They cut up our carpets and made saddle blankets for their horses. They killed every living thing except the rats and the dogs, and carried off all the remaining year's supply of foodstuffs. My parents and the Negroes lived a few days on the dead fowls before they spoiled and were of no use. The Yankees moved my mother's maid with her entire family into the room adjoining my mother's bedroom, thinking that she would be humiliated living in the house with her former slaves. But they proved to be a blessing to her. They cooked for the Yankees, and thus were able to get food for my parents, as long as the army was passing through. After the main army passed, the stragglers who followed were horrible. They put a rope around my father's neck and were going to hang him, but did not, as the Negro men interfered and were able to fight them off of our property. As soon as a woman was permitted again to ride the train, I went with my uncle, Colonel George Collier, and his wife back to my old home and my very distressed parents. After reaching Goldsboro, my uncle had to take the oath of allegiance to the United States government before it would be furnished with an old ragtop ambulance, 2 old blind cast-off army horses, and a driver. We had to cross the river on a floating pontoon bridge, the real bridge having been burned by our soldiers on their retreat. This precarious bridge was made of planks, placed crosswise on 2 lines of small boats. Upon my arrival at home, I found my poor mother still sick in bed, with her faithful servants still waiting on her. My parents and the Negroes were then drawing rations from the commissary in Goldsboro. The Negroes walking 9 miles, bringing their portions and my parents' portions of food in bags upon their backs. Then my brothers came home with only the clothes upon their backs. We borrowed beds from them from our neighbors who did not live along the march and therefore fared better. And when my father and brothers changed their underclothes, they went directly to bed. And then the women took their clothes to the river 1¼ miles from the house to wash. And this was the same river that we were forced to get our drinking water from, bringing it that distance in cans. Luckily, there was a Negro regiment stationed on our place, and before it disbanded, one of the officers found stored in a barn on the river about 4 miles from our house a small quantity of corn which had not been taken away. They brought it to the house, a cartload, and stored it in an upstairs bathroom. The back stairs ran up this hall, and with the windows all broken out, there was no way to keep the starving rats out of the corn. And at night, they went up the stairs by the hundreds. We would arm ourselves with sticks and beat among them, some nights killing almost a peck. The corn proved to help quite a bit in the way of food, and this varied our very sparse diet. Hardtack, fat meat, and bad coffee. We actually didn't drink coffee. All of the real coffee was sent during the war to the boys in the army. Our coffee was made of dried sweet potatoes, rye wheat, and barley that were all parched brown, ground up, put in a small bag. Then we would drop that bag in a coffee pot and boil it for 10 minutes. If you can believe it, an enterprising Yankee came south after the war and patented our homemade coffee and called it Postum. My father died in the October of 1865, but after the crop was gathered. My mother died in 1867, and then her land was divided among her children. Most of it we rented out for an income, but later, after my brother moved to Goldsboro, None of us wanted to live there, and so we sold our portions of land to our neighbors. I lived with my brother John at the old home until I was married in 1874 to Lieutenant William Penn at the late age of 27. My husband had left the University of North Carolina when the war started to join the 67th Regiment of the North Carolina Cavalry. My husband and I had but one son, Dr. William Kilpatrick Lane, whom we were very proud. There's so much more that I could relate to you, such as the terrible times of the Reconstruction days, but it would take far too long. What I have written already is sufficient to give you some idea of the turmoil that was suffered by families in the swath of the war. I placed this letter in a trunk for safekeeping for future generations of my family, so that our history and what we endured during the war would not be forgotten, and so that they might understand that it was not just the soldiers who suffered during this war. Thank you for letting me read you my letter. Have a good evening.
Good evening to you all.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Sally Irene Cox Ramsey, but I was Sally Cox for 53 years until I married into the name Ramsey. I was born in Brogden Township, right here in Wayne County. I was born on October 11th, 1877. My family moved when I was a little girl to Selma, so I grew up in Johnston County. I had 2 older brothers and 2 older sisters. They all lived through adulthood. I also had 2 younger siblings, one of which died at birth and another that died when she was 3 years old. My father was William Bass Cox and my mother Penelope Holloman Cox. My father was a farmer, so my family lived a reasonably normal and happy existence. I helped around the house until 1903, when I was 25 years old. I got a job at the Interstate Telephone Company. It might not sound like much, but it gave me freedom and the chance to make money of my own. At the time, we only had 2 subscribers to the company, and the only outlet was a long-distance line to Goldsboro. My career furthered when my family moved to Goldsboro. The Bell system bought out the Interstate Telephone Company, and I became a Bell employee. My working hours were from 5:30 p.m. to 8 o'clock a.m. By 1906, I was promoted to chief operator, and we telephone operators worked very long hours. Nowadays, it might not sound like much, but being a telephone operator was a big step forward for women. The jobs that women could look forward to was mostly teaching and nursing, and that is if you could afford the education. If you were a girl like me who only made it through the 8th grade, then you could look forward to primarily domestic work. And if you were to marry and have children, then your work would be the home. At the time when phones were more readily available to the public, you couldn't dial directly to the person you wanted to speak with. A telephone operator had to manually find your switchboard part and switch it on over so your line would be connected to the person you wanted to speak with. As phones became more popular, instead of labeling the switchboard with names, you were assigned numbers instead. Originally, switchboard operators were young boys, but they proved to be rude and unruly. So much so that the telephone company decided to switch it up and hire young women. The women proved to be far more reliable for the company. Thus, being a telephone operator became one of the only technically oriented jobs available for women. About 10 years into my career in Goldsboro, I was reminded how crucial my job could be. On the morning of July 16th, 1914, I was given a call by a Mr. Newell. Mr. Newell was the superintendent of the coastline. There had been a wreck. A train had been derailed and it destroyed 65 rails of track.
the scheduling was going to change a lot of train times, and we wanted to make sure that we could prevent further disaster. Mr. Newell could not contact his train dispatcher, so between the two of us, we were able to contact the necessary people to help this problem de-escalate. I have to say that I was exhausted by the end of it all, but my grit and my nerve kept me focused. I was even written up in the local newspaper. The article described me as intelligent, resourceful, and courteous. Perhaps I'm all of those things, but the telephone company was highly responsible, for their training was thorough and exacting. In order to be hired for the telephone company, your height, weight, and your arm length were all considered, meaning if you were under 5 feet, you need not apply. Also, those with foreign accents. You were to only use the language that the telephone company provided. And numbers were to be read in a very exact way. For example, the number 2000 would be read as 2000, and 4001 would be read aloud as 4001. You had a strict dress code, your hair needed to be pulled back, and you needed to sit straight up, staying focused on the switchboard. You couldn't have conversations with the people you were working with, not even in a whisper. There was also an unwritten rule. It is that if you married, you lost your job. Oh, but the work was amazing, and I took great pride in working in that company. You may have heard of the Hello Girls who served during World War I. They were 200 women who facilitated communication between American, British, and French troops along the Western Front. I am proud to say that the Hello Girls, along with the nurses and the ambulance drivers, we took part in convincing President Wilson to drop his objection towards women's suffrage. So yes, I was able to vote. About 6 years after the train incident, I believe 1920, I was promoted and I moved to Norfolk, Virginia, where I was to be in charge of 30 girls. I enjoyed Norfolk. It was a great change from Goldsboro, and I enjoyed it very much. By the time my career ended, I had been working with the telephone company for 36 years. Oh, the changes I saw were amazing. One change is that unwritten rule I mentioned about. In 1930, I was married, and I was able to keep my job. I married Robert Henry Ramsey when I was 53 years old. Mr. Ramsey was 5 years older than me. He was married before, and his wife had died. We were able to have 13 wonderful years together before he passed away in 1943. I lived on in Norfolk until I was 77 when I passed away. Now here I am, back in Wayne County, lying alongside my husband and my mother. I lived, I loved, and I served. What more could I ask for? Thank you all for listening.
For what is it to die, but to stand naked in the wind and to melt into the sun? And what is it to cease breathing, but to free the breath from its restless tides, that it may rise and expand and seek God unencumbered? Only when you drink from the river of silence shall you indeed sing. And when you reach the mountaintop, then shall you begin to climb. And when the earth shall claim your limbs, then shall you truly dance. I greet you with the words of Khalil Gibran, a Lebanese American poet. Reciting poetry has always been a joy of mine. Khalil Gibran is a suitable choice for my greeting because, like Gibran, my beginnings were not here in America. I am Shikri Bador. I was born in Hamana, Lebanon in 1875. Hamana was an agricultural village about 30 miles from Beirut. The silk industry was an important industry in my land, and it had begun to decline. And I had heard that the streets of America were paved with gold, so that's where I decided to go. At the age of 19, I left my country, my friends, and my family. My first stop was Ellis Island, and then from there to Lebanon, Tennessee, where I operated a grocery store with my cousin. Lebanon was a nice place to settle. The residents there gave it the nickname of Cedar City because of the biblical cedars of Lebanon that thrived there. It was a nice touch of home in an otherwise foreign place. And I soon became acquainted with a young woman from the Lebanese community. We got married and began to build a house together. We had a daughter, Rose, and twin sons, Joseph and Charles. Our happy home life, however, was interrupted in 1898 when America went to war with Spain. An event happened earlier that year that really roused Americans. You see, the people of Cuba were fighting for independence from Spain, and there were many Americans and American businesses in Cuba. So the United States sent the battleship USS Maine to Havana Harbor to protect the Americans and their businesses. One night, there was an explosion on the battleship that killed hundreds of American men. We believe it was the hand of Spain at work. Newspapers disappeared as soon as they hit the stands, and "Remember the Maine" became a rallying cry. Wanting to do something to help my adopted country, I enlisted in the Lebanon, Tennessee Infantry, and the infantry was incorporated into the U.S. military, and we were sent to Cuba to fight. The infantry did see battle, but we did not get the publicity that the cavalry did. I'm sure you've all heard of Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. Thankfully, the war was over in a few months, and I was able to return home to my family. I was awarded American citizenship for my service in the Spanish-American War, and all was well at my home in Tennessee. But I missed Lebanon, the land of my birth, and the people I had left behind. So in 1900, we returned to Lebanon. After only being in America for 8 years, I had become quite used to the rights that we have here, especially the freedom of speech, which was not present in the Ottoman Empire. The breaking point was a conflict I had with a Turkish officer where I refused to salute him, letting him know that not only was I Lebanese, but I was also American. And it was not long after that we returned to the United States. But not all was going to be peace and contentment. Shortly after returning home, my wife fell sick and died. Looking for a fresh start, I took my family to Atlantic City, New Jersey, attracted by the new opportunities in this newly founded city, and also the beautiful beaches. It was here in Atlantic City that I was to find love again. Several years after moving there, I met this young woman named Victoria Alcazan. We fell in love and were married in 1912. We had a daughter, Evelyn, and a son, Philip. Victoria was also an immigrant from Lebanon, coming from Beirut with her family when she was young. And in 1915, we moved to Goldsboro. I had kept in touch with a few friends of mine from Lebanon, George and Joe Farfer. And shortly thereafter, I opened a sewing shop with my brother-in-law, George Reyes. It was located on the corner of Center Street and Chestnut. We named it the Southern Manufacturing Company, and at its peak, we employed 15 to 20 persons. I operated as the salesman, and I went from Virginia to Georgia to South Carolina, selling our garments to various Lebanese businessmen. However, we were successful, but our business was burned out in a fire that originated from a printing shop on the first floor. In the 1920s, while traveling around the Mount Olive area, I noticed an overabundance of cucumbers, which sparked a business idea. Initially, I wanted to produce pickle brine, but I realized that pickling the cucumbers themselves would be a much more promising business venture. I tried to get other members of the Lebanese community to join me in this venture, but was unsuccessful. But then I met George H. Moore after advertising for someone more experienced in the pickle business already. Together, me and George started a pickle business, and he operated as plant manager. I continued to do what I enjoyed, sales. We were successful, but we realized we needed more financing. So thanks to the capital provided by a number of Mount Olive businessmen, we were incorporated into the Mount Olive Pickle Company in 1926. I stuck with the company for several years before deciding to depart. I sold my stock and purchased a home on Chestnut Street for my now 8 children. It was a great escape at the end of a busy day, and I'd assumed a new position as a salesman for the Kate's Pickle Company. Throughout my years, I became a leader in American Syrian circles throughout North Carolina. I became president of the Hamana American Association, which helped to preserve the traditions that we held dear. President Woodrow Wilson appointed me as a member of the Near East Relief Commission. And as a member, I traveled throughout the southern states advocating for support and relief for the Lebanese and Armenian refugees who were suffering oppression underneath the Ottoman Empire. I was also a member of the Masonic Order of Goldsboro and a 32nd degree Mason. I was also a member of the Sudan Temple of the Shrine in New Bern. Unfortunately, my life was cut short at the age of 64 due to injuries I sustained from an automobile accident. My life was most satisfactory, full of joy and sorrow. But since I opened with words from Khalil Gibran, I shall conclude with words from Khalil Gibran. To look back upon one life with satisfaction is to live twice. Good evening, good people.
Son of Sweet Union, that's what everybody always called me. You see, I was born in Monroe, North Carolina, the county seat of Union County. I was born May 8th, 1898, the second of 4 children. I was born with congenital cataracts in both eyes. There was never a time when my eyes weren't a source of pain, of trouble, of distress, yes, and of fear, if you will. I couldn't play like the other boys, so I spent my time reading and hanging out in the kitchen helping Mama cook. Now, I could read by adopting a most awkward position. I would cover my left eye with my left hand, forming a slit between my thumb and my index finger. That makes kind of a lens, and through this slit I would peer, and then with my right hand bring the book or the page almost up against my face, and I could read like that. I grew up tall and thin, finally reaching 6'6". Mama always said I had to drink muddy water to make a shadow. I graduated high school in 1917 and was the first in my family to go to college. I received a 2-year scholarship to Trinity College from a prominent Union County businessman. The other 2 years of my tuition I had to borrow money for, but some Monroe men went in on my banknote and I was able to raise the necessary funds. Mama would send me $1 or $2 in a letter when she could to help me along. Now, with my tuition covered, I had to find a way to pay for my board. Now, my junior year, I became Trinity College's first paid publicity director, making $35 a month. I had been involved in the college's newspapers and yearbooks and had started a monthly literary magazine. I always knew I was born to write. Now, as an aside, some of you Duke fans might be interested to know that I had a hand in naming Trinity College's football teams the Blue Devils. I had read an article about the famous Blue Devil legions of France in World War I. So I made the suggestion and it was adopted. Now let me back up a little bit. My office as the publicity director was down the hall from Trinity President William Few, and his secretary was Lucille Bullard, a recent graduate of Trinity. She and I began exchanging a few pleasantries, and by were chummy enough to share a subscription to the News and Observer. This began a beautiful team up with the lady I affectionately called the general manager. Now, the summer of my sophomore and junior years, I underwent surgeries to remove the congenital cataracts and finally was able to buy a car and could drive. Aha, freedom. Well, I graduated college and received an offer to teach freshman English and journalism at Wake Forest College. I could finally afford to support a wife, and Lucille and I were married in October of 1923. The following summer, I did graduate work at Columbia University, and then the year after that, took a leave of absence from Wake Forest. I had reached that proverbial fork in the road in my career. It's about this time we were blessed with our only child, our daughter Marie. And I decided to leave teaching and take the job that I'd been offered to come be the business manager for the Goldsboro News. Now, a year after Lucille and I moved to Goldsboro, we bought the house on 1409 East Walnut Street. It became our only home. Now, when we bought that house, it was a frame house, but was later brick veneered as a result of a contest sponsored by the Borden Brick and Tile Company. You see, I submitted the winning 25-word or less entry on how to use brick. Now, in 1929, the Goldsboro News merged with the Goldsboro Daily Argus to become the Goldsboro News Argus, and I became its managing editor. I held that position for 20 years, during which our nation, our state, and our community weathered the Great Depression and the Second World War. In 1949, I became the editor-in-chief of the Goldsboro News Argus. Now, in an editorial, I had written that I am a man of sorrow and acquainted with grief, but anything I'd experienced paled to that day in 1950, February 28th, when our daughter Marie died in an automobile accident at the age of 25. She'd been married but a year, and she and her husband were on their way to Goldsboro to visit us. Marie is buried beside me here in Willowdale. Now, all my adult life, I fought a battle to avoid going blind, and in 1953, I underwent 6 surgeries. Following year, I suffered a heart attack and the final detachment of the retina in my good left eye. And so I was left with 1/5 normal vision in my right eye. I was blessedly referred to Dr. Feinblum in New York City, who fitted me with special glasses so I could read again. Now, this began Lucille's and mine annual jaunts to New York City, where we enjoyed seeing shows and dining with Kenneth Royal and his wife. Now, the Royals kept an apartment on Fifth Avenue, but they were always just Goldsboro folks to us. You might have heard of Kenneth Royal. Well, in 1961, I received the North Carolina Handicapped Person of the Year Award from Governor Sanford. Now, as I told the audience at the event, of all the people that have inspired and encouraged me along the way, most of all, I owe a debt that I cannot pay to my CNI wife, the general manager, I call her. She has been secretary, companion, a wailing wall in times of frustration. She pushed back the loneliness and with patience and understanding has been ever by my side. Now, as I handed her the award, someone asked me, "So, how does it feel to be the North Carolina Handicapped Person of the Year?" And I replied, "About like the man watching his mother-in-law drive over a 1,000-foot cliff in his brand new Cadillac. I have mixed emotions." For 25 years, I'd served on the Board of Trustees at East Carolina University. And while attending a meeting there in 1971, I blacked out and fell from my chair. I was subsequently confined to my home, where I continued to write my weekly column. The following summer, I entered the Guardian Care Nursing Home, accompanied by the general manager, who took a room there so we could continue to be together. I passed from this life in my sleep in October of that year. Death, as it must to us all, finally came to me. And so I bid you all a good night from the son of sweet youth. Good night.
Freedom and liberty come not just with words. They come with hard work and sacrifice. With hard work and sacrifice. I know this to be true. You see, I immigrated to the United States when I was just 15 years old. But let me go back and so you understand why. I was born Vasily Palantzas on the 15th of September of 1896 in a small village of Thessalia, Greece. We only have about 300 people in our village. My parents' names were Dmitri and Anston. My father, Dmitri, he was a shoemaker. I was the oldest of 7 children, and I was able to attend school in a nearby village until I was 4th grade. But then I have to go back to the house to help survive work. When I was 15, something happened that would save my family and change my life. A cousin who had immigrated to the United States, he came to visit my family. He told us about opportunity for jobs and money there. He was well dressed and he had enough money to pay for my passage on a steamer back to the land of opportunity, America. So my father here urged me to go, to make money, to help the family. I was sad to leave my country and go to a strange place, but hungry will make you go anywhere. So I left from the port of Athens with my cousins and 10 other village boys. We went by steamer and we landed at Ellis Island in early of 1912. Now, when an immigrant comes to Ellis Island, they have to prove that they could support themselves, and they're required to have a job and have $20 on their person. I was so afraid that my $20 would get stolen on the ship that I kept it in my shoe, and I slept with my shoes on the entire voyage. Yeah. We traveled in steerage. It was the only way that we could afford. Just before the ship landed at Ellis Island, they brought us out on the deck from steerage, and they spray us all down with water. Now, I gave them $1 for a bag lunch. I was determined to save $2 so I could send the rest back to my family. At Ellis Island, we got in these big lines in this big building, and these inspectors, they made sure we're healthy and that we're legally allowed to stay in America. I was so afraid that I would not pass. At one point, I looked over my shoulder and I saw the lady, the Statue of Liberty. And I knew from then on that I was going to be all right. From Ellis Island, everyone separate. I had a job in New Hampshire. Others went to Virginia, Detroit, and Ohio. I went on to Manchester, where I worked at the Monsky Mill. I worked in the bleaching department of the cotton mill. I worked long hours. I made $5 a week. Even as little as that may seem, it was more money than I had ever seen. So I lived in the boarding house with 5 other boys from my village. There was a large Greek community in Manchester, so I felt good about it, and I didn't have to learn too much English. It was comforting to me to be around so many of my own people. I remember walking to and from work and seeing all the beautiful fruits and vegetables displayed for sale on the sidewalk and in the windows. And I dreamed of the day that I could afford such luxurious food. Well, I stayed in Manchester until about 1919, when I was about 23 years old. After the First World War, strikes came to the factory and I have no job now. So I decided to move south. So I went to Norfolk, Virginia, and I found a job washing dishes. I only stayed a few weeks before I came at last here to Goldsboro. I had cousins here, you see, and it was not easy for a young Greek man to be accepted in those days. But as we dress better and we speak English better, we were accepted more. At first in Goldsboro, I worked for my cousins, who were called Mike Williams and William Williams. It was at this time that I began calling myself Bill Williams. But I always kept my name of Vasily Palantzas. My cousins, they operated the Newark Cafe at the corner of Walnut and Carolina Street down by the train depot. My other cousin, he owned the Terminal Hotel, which is across from the depot. All the businesses in those days, they were down by the train station. There was not much uptown at all. At first, I washed dishes, but then I learned to cook. About 3 years later, in 1923, I found a small store on Center Street, near the corner of Center and Walnut Street, and I opened a small hot dog stand. And I never left that spot. I had a very good lunch from the day I started. With me, I had a partner, Chris Columbus, who was buried right down there. In 1925, two longtime friends came to work with us, Charlie Gogolos and Tom Xanthus. I'm very proud to say that during the Depression, my partner and I, we were able to keep our doors open every day. And we even made enough money to operate. And then I sent money back to my family in Thessalia, as much as they needed and as much as I could afford, of course. But by this time, my hot dog stand, it turned into a restaurant, and we named it Central Lunch. We served traditional American food, and we soon became a local favorite. Our fried oysters and our veal cutlets with tomato sauce, those were especially popular. We also served free coffee and donuts to local police officers. Unfortunately, my partner Chris died in 1942. Oh yes, I forgot to mention the night that they took up the railroad tracks down Center Street. You see, for years, everyone in Goldsboro wanted the railroad tracks removed. They were right down the middle of the street. A Union Station had been built already, so they could go right around, but they didn't. The people in Goldsboro resented the endless stream of trains. They kept the air filled with smoke and cinders, and freight trains unloaded flour and hay and fertilizers right in front of wholesale houses, keeping the streets filled with litter. Finally, on the night of April 2nd of 1926, acting on the orders of the Board of Aldermen of Goldsboro, the city manager carried out the removal of the tracks. At midnight, about 100 men began taking up the tracks. And by morning, it was all done. And I kept Central Lunch open all night. I served coffee and donuts to keep everyone alert and awake. I lived above my restaurant until I could make enough money to afford a better place. When I was able, I moved across the street to the Hotel Goldsboro. It was there that I met my wife, Nancy. She was working at the hotel because she had transferred from a hotel from the western part of the state, you see. I remember when I first saw her, she was so beautiful. Well, we eloped to Dillon, South Carolina, and we were married on Valentine's Day in 1942. After that, we moved to a house on Spruce Street, several blocks away from the hotel. We only lived there a little more than a year before we were able to build our house on Jackson Street, right across from Goldsboro High School, you see. Now, my first daughter, Anne, she celebrated her first birthday in our new home. 3 years later, our second daughter, Billy, was born. We had a very happy home. Do you remember me telling you about the fruits and the vegetables I longed for when I was a boy in New Hampshire? Well, my house had enough land that I was able to plant an apple tree, plum trees, cherry tree, peach tree, grapevine, and I grew pomegranates as well. The pomegranate is an important addition because it's a symbol of abundance and good luck in my home country of Greece. Through the years, I was able to buy the house next to us, and I built other houses on that area. this ownership, it made me feel like I was really an American. As Central Lunch and family was central to our life. My wife Nancy and all the girls, they become part of the business. Nancy, she was the bookkeeper, and the girls, we told them they had to work for their allowances and type the lunch and dinner menus, and Billy, she kept Mr. Charlie company up front. I've always been thankful for the opportunities America gave me. I was so proud during World War II to help my adopted country raise money for the war bond sales. At first in Goldsboro, people weren't buying bonds. So I bought one for $1,000. The newspaper, they wrote up my donation, which prompted war bond sales in our area to increase greatly. They said, if an immigrant can invest $1,000 in our war effort, then surely we can too. I was also proud to be able to donate money for the restoration of the Statue of Liberty, the lady who gave me so much courage and encouragement when I needed it so desperately. Throughout the years, I longed to return to my village and visit my parents and the rest of my family. Sadly, my father died before I could return. In 1953, I finally was able to go. I went alone, leaving my family at home. My mother was ill and I went to see her. I had planned to stay for 6 months, but it was right after the Communist War and things were very bad over there. So I only stayed a couple of months. About 20 years later, I was able to return, and this time I brought Nancy with me. I was finally able to show her what I had told her about for so long. Shared memories are always the best. Through the years, my daughters, they were able to go and visit in Greece and make connections with their Greek family members. In 1966, after 43 years, I sold Central Lunch and I retired. My longtime friends Charlie and Tom retired with me. I had built a business I was proud of, and if you worked for me, you became a member of my family. I sold the business because I was tired, and it was time. I didn't have any plans, just to live day by day. Because I'd spent so much time on my feet, I would go for a walk several times a day. I also tended to my fruit trees. I worked in my garden. And in my later years, I would go every morning to the Sunrise Shopping Center and I would have coffee with all the other men that retired. And yes, of course, I spent more time with my wonderful family. My daughters added to our family by marrying good men, and I was a proud grandfather of 2 wonderful grandchildren. I passed away peacefully 7 October 1992 at the age of 96, and I was buried here next to my infant daughter who died at birth the day after Christmas in 1944. I came to this country with nothing, and I make progress. Only the United States can make a man make progress. This country gave me that opportunity. God bless you and good night. Thank you.